So moving on now, our next item on the agenda is a document of the Ukraine, which Roger is presenting. Yeah, so I'll bring Roger over. How long do you want to speak for? Have you got a time or just to listen?
I'm not going to speak for very long, I think.
Right, he's not going to speak for very long, but we'll see. Right, here's Roger.
Okay, comrades, it looks like this is going to be an unexpectedly controversial topic for discussion. Nothing wrong with that if we discuss it in a comradely and collaborative way in order to reach a common conclusion. The world is hurtling towards a precipice. There is, in the same way, I think Nigel made the point this morning. He said that actually there's been wars ever since the Second World War. There hasn't been a day of peace, actually. We've had the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War, we had the Iraq War, and many local wars and all the rest of it. In the same way, between the First and Second World Wars, there was not really a day of peace. There was the Spanish Civil War, the invasion of Ethiopia, many other skirmishes in Europe and all the rest of it. And in a way, you could say that the period up in the first half of the 20th century was almost, you could say, a 30 years war. But the same way too, we're hurtling towards a catastrophe, because the wars that have been happening now, each one has been more devastating and nearer to the centers of the most developed countries of the world. So in Ukraine now, this is not the last war. This is one of many wars which are going to spread and engulf us all, and it's a bloodbath. Comrades have questioned the exact figures, but I think there's no reason to doubt. It's absolutely reliable, the idea that tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides, the Russian and the Ukrainian side, have been killed, with overall military casualties estimated at 500,000. Now, as I say, in a situation like this, and it's very complicated, because there are all kinds of currents, countercurrents, and subcurrents that need to be analysed. We're all trying to reach an insight into these complex and dangerous processes. And in order to do that, what we need is a clear vision and a humble and sincere approach to studying the information and the data. I took it on myself to make a study of the situation, to try to make sense of the Ukraine war. And maybe I made some mistakes here and there. If there are mistakes, of course, that's the point of this. Let's collectively discuss them, sharpen and refine our ideas. But what there is no place for is recriminations or abuse. That only clouds the issue. Personal venom only discredits the authors and not the target. And the vitriolic tone in which some of the criticisms have been made don't help us to throw light on the issues at all. And I'm going to try to not to fall into the trap, if you like, of trying to counter the accusations and the slanders that have been made in criticism of this, and try to stick to the issues themselves in order to help to clarify them. Now, Ukraine, what we need to do then, as I say, is to correct any mistakes in community debate, and to try to clarify the issues. Now, Ukraine, you see, one of the main strands in the issue that's been, and in the criticism of the document that I wrote, is it true or isn't it true that there is a division between the West and the East Ukrainians in their allegiances, in their identification, in their self-identification and so on. It would be very, very surprising, even if we didn't know by empirical evidence, it would be very surprising if it wasn't the case. Because Ukraine, until the Russian Revolution, Ukraine was never a united, unified country. It was divided between the Polish-Lithuanian hierarchy, the Austro-Habsburg Empire, the Russian Empire. It was carved up. Even, of course, then in the Second World War, it was divided in two. And in fact, there's just no argument about it. If you listen to the propaganda of the Bandera supporters and so on, they say we are Galicians. The only real Ukrainians are Galicians. There is a constant turmoil, constant aggravation and provocations between the West and the East, and in particular has been, of course, the war since 2014. These aren't inventions. It just makes no sense for comrades to just dismiss them and say no such thing and so on. Look, we have a comrade here with us now whose wife and stepson and father-in-law are refugees from Odessa in the east of Ukraine, and who are here there because they're sheltering and escaping from the most monstrous persecution. I'm sure Comrade Patrick will come into the discussion and say more about this. That is the issue. To dismiss this as simply an invention is just not serious. Now, as I say, I mean, this isn't just a recent development either. I mean, Ukraine was divided from the 17th century onwards between, as I say, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Russia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, but also at the end of the First World War, it was a battleground between nationalists, anarchists, white Russians, Bolsheviks, Austria, Germany, Poland, Romania, France, and again in the Second World War, as I say, a battlefield between Germany and Russia. And the instability of Ukraine has its origins in this divided history. So what's the real nature of this war? Of course, every war, from the point of view of imperialism, is always a question of coming heroically to the rescue of some poor little innocent, defenseless victims. So it was little Serbia in the First World War, little Belgium in the Second World War, little Poland in the Second World War, the poor Falkland Islanders, Britain in particular. It only ever fights against cartoon cut-out pantomime monsters, you know, the Kaiser and then Hitler, General Galtieri in Argentina, Milosevic in Serbia, Osama bin Laden, the Taliban, Saddam Hussein, and so on. It was always, and what we see the same thing here. It's Putin, the monster. Now we have to get away from comic strip commentary on historical developments. The war in Ukraine has an origin. It has material and historical foundations. Now, on this question, you know, I'm quoted as when I say that Russia is a secondary regional imperialist power, and that's grossly distorted into a kind of allegation that I'm saying that a secondary imperialist power is somehow better or more to be defended against a major imperialist power like Russia. That was not the point of the argument at all. I mean, comrades, if they're going to attack my document, they should read it, because what was said quite clearly, on the contrary, the reason why the point is made that Russia is a secondary regional imperialist power is precisely as an argument against those people that we've come across all the time in Britain on left circles, who say, well, we have to defend Russia because it's not an imperialist power. We have to defend it against imperialism. And the USA is an imperialist power, and therefore we have to protect Russia. And what we're arguing is just the opposite of what the comrades are alleging. We're saying, no, Russia is an imperialist power. Yes, a secondary one. Yes, not a major superpower in the sense that the USA is, but it's an imperialist power with imperialist ambitions in relation to Ukraine and, of course, elsewhere. And so, when I'm accused of saying, well, dismissing again, this came, I think, not in the French comrades' document, but in another document that they obviously feel supportive of. I'm accused in another document by another critic of not mentioning the fact that Putin is trying to annihilate the very identity and existence of Ukraine as a nation. Absolutely false. On the contrary, there's a whole page here about, on the contrary, that Putin started by justifying the invasion on the defense of the rights of the peoples of Donetsk and Lugansk. But on the contrary, the idea of protecting their right of self-determination is a completely cynical argument by Putin. There were tens of thousands of Chechens who have died fighting Putin's forces for precisely that same right. And this is a direct quote from my document. It was not long before Putin was resorting to Russian Orthodox medievalism by rubbishing Ukraine's very national identity, dismissing it as an artificial construct, quote, created by Bolshevik communist Russia. This was a threat to annihilate Ukraine and swallow it up, and that was originally the war aim of Putin, and that is still the long-term objective. And therefore, to imply that we're somehow defending Russia, or in a mealy-mouthed or somehow some covert way trying to apologize for the Russian thing, it's completely false, and it can be seen to be false by looking at the document itself. So it's refuted, and there are many other distortions that I need to correct. I'm sorry. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine, at the same time, we have to say, is it's not just irrational. It's not simply a question of a demented monster who's decided to start behaving like a bully. That's comic strip, as I say. That's comic strip politics. That's not the way that we need to analyse. That a Marxist analyses the situation. And for instance, the collapse of Russia after the breakup of the USSR in the 90s is dismissed, or so, well, somehow that we're saying there's something wrong with it or something. It was a collapse rarely paralleled in history. There was a 65% drop in GDP. There's a drop in life expectancy from 65 to 58, almost overnight. It was one of the worst material setbacks or disasters in history. And this question about the objectives of imperialism, again, it's completely dismissed in the argument of the French comrades that that there was any attempt on behalf of Western imperialism, any attempt to expand NATO or to surround Russia. I mean, I've given quote after quote after quote. In the whole thing, it's countless facts and quotes that have been given of NATO encirclement, and of course it makes sense. If, as we all seem to agree, that the USA is preparing for a future war with China, then wouldn't it make perfect sense that, first of all, when China has a superpower ally with armed with a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons, wouldn't it make sense to neutralize and somehow emasculate this dangerous superpower ally of China before they open up a war with China? And so, first of all, they have to remove China's nuclear ally, before they'll feel the confidence to be able to launch an outright offensive against China. And this question about the encirclement of Russia by NATO, which is happening, of course, it's gone to almost I think 32 countries now, from 14, I think, from 12 countries, sorry, in the past. It's got nuclear-capable missile bases installed only 100 miles and 12 minutes flight from Moscow. That's in Poland and in Romania. And all the quotes that I've given, this is the main point. I haven't quoted one Russian source. I haven't quoted Putin once, except one complaint that he made. The people that I've quoted in support of that are people like Henry Kissinger. I'm sure you're not going to say that he's an apologist for Putin. Henry Kissinger, George Kennan, another Cold War strategist from the 50s and 60s onwards. Robert McNamara, who was Johnson's Secretary of Defense. Paul Nitzer, Richard Pipes, Robert Gates, and especially many quotes are given here in the document from William Burns, who is the current director of the CIA. And the quotes are there, and they're absolutely clear. It's just impossible, unless you've got your eyes shut, to dismiss as a fairy tale or as an invention the idea that they are embarking on a dangerous game to provoke Russia and to encircle Russia and to provoke a war with Russia, and that is what is going on. And I mean, comrades, read the documents. There's no time to read out. There are so many quotes that I made. But I mean, if you look at that, I mean, there's hardly anything that needs to be added on that. William Burns, as I say, currently head of the CIA. The USA's probably most perceptive contemporary diplomat, who said that it was any move to bring Ukraine into NATO, he said, would split the country and cause civil war. And what's happened? The country has been split. There's a civil war, and it's an open proxy war by American imperialism there. I can't think of any other arguments to use because it's so plain. It's as plain as the nose on your face that is what is going on. And for the comrades to dismiss it is just beyond belief. And as I say, well, the Kissinger himself. I won't give all the quotes here. They're all there for you to read. So it's a strategy. If you want on this question of a proxy war, again, that's not a phrase that was made up by me. It's a quotation from several of these American diplomats and intellectuals, including, by the way, the former Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, who said in so many words, quote, "The USA, backed by the whole of NATO, is in a long proxy war with Russia, with Ukraine as the battlefield." Now, you can't say plainer than that. Is he spouting Putin propaganda? What are the comrades trying to argue? It's a protracted, covert proxy war, just as, if you like, the proxy war on a much lesser scale that was conducted by US imperialism when Russia was at war in Afghanistan during the 1980s. It's the same. Now, what about this question of the fascist forces and so on? Again, the comrades dismiss it as a complete myth. But there is a long history for this, going back to the Nazis, going back to Bandera, going back to the reactionary Ukraine pro-imperialists of the past, going back to the pre-First World War and so on. There's been a constant division of the Ukrainian-speaking population of the West and the Russian-speaking population of the East. And this, again, is just historical facts. It's not a question of interpretation. It's a question of and as for the attacks of imperialism, look at this figure again. Between 2012 and 2016, the entire Ukrainian GDP was cut by a quarter. A massive drop, a massive cut in living standards and in the whole status of Ukraine. Again and again, attempts were made to make peace in relation to the conflicts with the Russian-speaking provinces of Donbass. The whole history of genocide, the whole history. Another figure that in the Holocaust, 1/4 of the Jewish population, 1/4 of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust were in Ukraine. An absolutely colossal figure. I mean, this idea that the Azov Battalion and Bandera and Svoboda and all these things are just little details to be brushed aside. There is a long tradition in Western Ukraine, which of course gained extra currency with resistance to domination by Russia at the time of the USSR. The long history of fascism within the Western Ukrainian population. The reason, it's they've said in so many words that I've seen videos, friends. I've seen on YouTube videos where they were questioning ordinary people in Western Ukraine, saying, "What do you think of the people of East Ukraine?" And they were spitting. So these people they're not human beings. These are rats. These are reptiles. These are animals. There is, because of historical reasons and because it's been whipped up, of course, particularly by imperialism and so on, there is a whole history of that. And again, as I say, there are comrades here who can argue about that. A long history of racism and of every kind of communalism within the Ukraine tradition. My grandfather, my grandfather came from Odessa himself. Believe it or not, he was a contemporary of Trotsky. I don't think he was a Trotskyist, but he was born around the same time, and he had to flee as a young man, probably about a teenager or early 20s. He had to somehow find his way across Europe by hitching, by jumping on trains, by walking. Somehow he made it. He made it as far as the Channel. Somehow he got across the Channel, and he made it with his brother. They were traveling together, the two of them. With his brother, made it as far as Liverpool. Why Liverpool? Because that was the gateway to the USA, the land of promise. When they got to Liverpool, it's a little bit of a side, but still I can't resist telling the story. When they got to Liverpool, they couldn't rub together enough cash to pay for their fare to USA, so they had enough to spin a coin. They spun a coin, and my grandfather lost. So I've got distant and forgotten relatives somewhere in USA, and here I am. But I mean, this is one story out of so many, out of thousands, tens of thousands. Why is there such a scattered Ukrainian population? Why are there so many Ukrainian Jews in Britain and Europe and in the USA and of course in Israel? Why? Because of the long history of pogroms and racism and discrimination there. And of course, the Western Ukraine had not even been, until the Russian Revolution, had no connection for centuries before with Russia itself. They'd been part, as I say, of Poland, Lithuania, and Austria in that time. And of course, they were unwilling hostages, if you like, once under Stalinism, to to the Stalinist exploitation. And I mean, Ukraine should have been one of the richest countries or richest republics within the USSR. And it was because it was systematically starved, because it went through the Holodomor, the systematic starvation of millions of people in the famine in the early 20s, because of all the great power chauvinism of Russia and so on. It went through all that. And by the way, talking about Crimea, another complete falsehood, let's not say a lie. It could be that the comrades hadn't read my document properly. Let's be charitable and generous and say that. But it is not true that there's no mention made of the horrific genocidal crime of what happened to the Tatar population of Crimea. The Crimean Tatars who'd been there for centuries and who were forcibly transported and with half the population just liquidated in the process and transported to Central Asia. But nevertheless, the existing population of Crimea are Russians. They're people who were shipped into Ukraine from other parts of the USSR in order to provide labor fodder for the factories and the industrial complexes and the mines of Western Ukraine. And this idea that somehow there is no national question in Eastern Ukraine is just a complete. I mean, it just completely flies in the face of what is known to be reality. It just does not stand up to any kind of scrutiny. And therefore, you see, again, I'm misquoted in the document, but at the time of the breakup of the USSR in 1991, the population of Crimea didn't vote to join Ukraine. That's not the case. The population of Crimea voted overwhelmingly by a margin of 94% to 6%. I'm not talking about the recent referendum, which it's open to argument that the figures might have been fiddled and so on. Who was fiddling that in 1991 when the USSR completely fell to pieces, when it's disintegrated? In whose interest would it have been, and who was it who would have had the means in order to fix the referendum, to fill the referendum? By a referendum, as I say, by a margin of 94% to 6%, they voted for autonomy. They did not want to join Ukraine. Of course, the only way that that Crimea became part of Ukraine rather than of Russia was on the personal whim, on a caprice of Khrushchev, who was himself a Ukrainian, of course, who in 1954, out of the blue, without any kind of warning or consultation, almost in a kind of act of drunken bravado, he simply said, I'll tell you what, let's put Crimea with Ukraine instead of with Russia. There might have been, I have read actually that there are other diplomatic considerations that might have been behind it. But one thing that didn't happen is they never asked the population of Crimea what they thought. Every time the Crimean population had been asked what they thought, in this referendum in 1991 and in the recent referendum, which I believe, because it makes sense with the ethnic composition of the existing Crimean population. So we don't need to bring in the question of the Crimean Tatars. There is a Tatar population there, but it's a very small minority. The vast majority of the population of Crimea are Russians. I don't know. You see, all of this thing that no, the Crimeans don't want to be part of Russia. The people of Donbass don't want to be part of Russia. Well, you may be right. I don't know. You don't know either. There's only one way to find out, and that's to ask them. And that's the idea that we call for the right of self-determination. It's not for anybody in Russia or in Ukraine or in Lee Valley Youth Hostel to say what the national identity or allegiances or affinity of the peoples of any area should be. And that's why we call for the right of self-determination. That's the only way. If you question, I mean, again, why is it that the comrades, who on all other questions have at least what approximates to a Marxist position about things, why do you not call for self-determination for the people of Donbass? It's not for you to say that no, there's no national question, they're not Russians, they belong to Crimea. You may be right, you may be wrong, but it's not for you to say, it's not for me to say, it's for them to say. And so the same goes with all the other slogans or demands that I put forward at the end. I'm coming to an end of that. But the question is that we cannot just dismiss the fact that under Zelensky, and of course Zelensky started as a very well-meaning character. He was, I mean, I saw the first couple of episodes of his television series, and it was hilarious. He was a very good comedian. But he did exploit, or not exploit, not to say that he did express the resentments and the fears and the anxieties of a large part of the population who were fearful of the oligarchy and of the pro-fascist sympathies of the oligarchy that dominated Ukraine, and that did, again, can't go into it again now, but who did manipulate the Maidan events, and also previously to that in 2004, the so-called Orange Revolution and so on. But when he came to power on a program of where I've got it here. He came to power on a program of peace, of trying to make peace. He's promising to make peace with Donbass, to uphold the Russian language rights, to start peace talks with Russia, to tackle corruption, to stand up to the oligarchs. As I say, some of his jokes were very, very much to the point. For instance, when under the Poroshenko regime before, he said, Obama is the real president of Ukraine. That was one of his jokes on his television series. Another one, he said, I want to get a copy of Mein Kampf, but I can't get one because it's sold out in Ukraine. And what did he mean by that? If Ukraine doesn't have a large fascist, large layer of sympathies with fascism, then what was the point of that joke? It just wouldn't make sense. We have to deal with reality as it is, and not as we would like it to be. So we have to say we support unconditionally the right of self-determination, the right of any people under attack to defend themselves, and we support, therefore, the rights of the people of Western Ukraine who are under attack to defend themselves against the Russian onslaught, and the right of the peoples of East Ukraine if they also want to withstand and resist the Russian attacks, and they probably do. My guess would be, and it is a guess, and all we can do is guess, and it's not up to us to guess, really, as I said before. But my guess is that they would want some form of autonomy within a united Ukraine, or maybe even independence as an independent entity. But those are options that are for them to decide. Now, what position should we take? I've quoted one. There are many examples that could be given, but I quoted what Trotsky said when Hitler was attacking Czechoslovakia at the time of the Munich crisis. He understood something which apparently Neville Chamberlain did not at the time of the Munich talks in 1938, because he said, "Look, Hitler is claiming to be just defending the rights of self-determination for the Sudeten Germans, but there is no reason to believe that he's going to stop there. He will take over the whole of Czechoslovakia." And then he went on to say, "What should our attitude be towards that?" And he says, "An imperialist war, no matter in what corner it begins, will be waged not for national independence, but for a redivision of the world in the interests of separate cliques of finance capital." And that's exactly what is happening now. It's nothing to do with the national rights of Ukraine. It's to do with the great power politics of the superpowers. And he said, "Marxists are not concerned with episodic shifts of military fronts during the new brawl of the imperialists, but with the uprising of the proletariat and its victory over all the imperialists." So what is taking place in Ukraine? I think the simplest way to look at this is to say this is not one war. There are three simultaneous wars being waged in Ukraine at the present time. First, there is the war of self-defense against the invasion of Russia. And we stand firmly with the right of self-determination for the people to resist the military occupation. And that's why we call for the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine. Secondly, there is the proxy war being waged by NATO, who care not one scrap for the rights of the Ukrainian people. As I say, they presided, their puppet regime presided over a complete, what do we say, a complete scrapping of the living standards of the economic level, a complete devastation that they introduced. They don't care about the rights or the living standards of the Ukrainian people. And there's a third war going on, which is a civil war between the Russian-speaking population of the East and the Ukrainian-speaking people of the West. It's a war it's a war of self-determination, a war of national rights for the peoples of the East. And as I say, what the solution would be is not for us to say, but it could be autonomy, it could be a division, it could be absorption into Russia, it could be independence, it could be any of those things. And we stand foursquare for the rights of any people. And that includes the Western Ukrainians. It also includes the Eastern Ukrainians, the rights of any people to determine for themselves their own status and their own relations with their neighbours. And on these three wars, I think that's very clear what our stance ought to be. We're outraged, and let's say this because again, this is denied by the comrades who are criticising our document. We are outraged at the criminal brutality of the Russian invasion. We're also outraged at the cynical exploitation of the long-suffering Ukrainian people by the USA as cheap surrogate cannon fodder in a global great game threatening a worldwide bloodbath, because that is what is happening. So what about, let's take finally our demands. The comrades are very dismissive and even a bit contemptuous of the demands that I make, but let's see what's wrong with them. One, the very first demand I make, immediate withdrawal of occupation forces. And I have to say, I don't blame the French comrades for this. I blame John Ryman for this, who wrote a really poisonous and dishonest critique of the position that I put forward on this. But he quotes from this document, or rather he misquotes from it, and he says, Roger says immediate withdrawal of occupation forces. He cannot even bring himself to say who the occupation forces are. Why doesn't he name the Russians? Well, here it is. This is in big, bold, black letters. Russia hands off Ukraine, immediate withdrawal of occupation forces. So yet another, you can only say a lie, it can't be a misunderstanding. That is something that we have to stand for. Yes, just finishing now. So complete solidarity with the people of Ukraine in defense of their democratic rights. Now, another thing I just want to mention. There was an article I read yesterday by our friends in Left Horizons. There was an article on Ukraine. So, well, what position should socialists take in relation to this? And there was nothing about any of this historical background, nothing about the rights of the people of East Ukraine. It was simply taken, as the French comrades also take it, that it was simply a question of the Ukrainian people under attack from the Russian states, without any kind of account made for the allegiances and the national identities of the different peoples within the Ukrainian state. But he says, well, we have to stand firmly for the rights of the Ukrainian people to defend themselves. And then he says, well, what do we say then about the use of American and NATO armaments? He says, well, we don't really like, the fact that NATO is involved in this. But after all, if we say that no, we should resist their use of NATO armaments, then the conclusion we'd have to say is that that's just hypocrisy, because how can they defend themselves if they don't get the arms supplies from the West? And so this conundrum, and it is a difficult one, we all know that. It's a very difficult question, but we have to take a principled stand on it. His stand on it, well, it's principled, but it's not very much use. His stand was to say, the only solution then is to say, yes, fight the war, and yes, take the American arms, but what we have to say is, there is no solution except socialism. Well, I'm sorry, but I mean, we can take any question in the world and simply end up with that kind of little, almost like venison at the end. So remember, but we want socialism. Until we get socialism, we're going to get war. But we have to say something. What I'm trying to do here in this is to say not just that, not just an abstract maximum program where we want socialism, we want socialism, we want socialism, but to say that that we want a transitional program, we want a workers' program for peace. And the workers' program for peace is to say, hands off Ukraine, Russia hands off Ukraine, immediate withdrawal of occupation forces, solidarity with the people of Ukraine in defense of their democratic rights, self-determination for the peoples of Donbass and Crimea on the basis of a genuinely democratic referendum, guaranteed Ukrainian neutrality, in other words, no allegiance to either NATO or to any new replacements on Russian side of the old Warsaw Pact, mutual demilitarization of the border territories on either side, and above all, unity of the workers of Russia and Ukraine in a common struggle to overthrow their corrupt reactionary oppressors. Now, I think that's the only legitimate stance for socialists to make. So I stand by that.
Thanks for that, Roger. We've actually got to just on 3:30, so I propose we take a 15-minute break now and then come back in. Just I can see Olivier's got his hand up. Is there anybody else? Olivier, I'll take you as soon as we come back. Is there anybody else other than Olivier that particularly wants to come in at this stage in the gallery? Right, so Olivier, who's that?
It's for me.
That's right. Yeah, I've got you. Right. Okay, we'll be back in 15. Yeah, hello, Olivier. We'll be back in 15 minutes now. We're just going to take a tea break and just give us a chance to stretch our legs. So if you can all come back at 10 to 4, and then we'll take you first, Olivier, and then we'll take the debate. Okay. Yep.
It's tea break. Oh. It's tea break now.
The break is now, yes. We're having.
Yeah, okay, in 15 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, you can come back at 10 to Olivia. Okay, thank you very much. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Of invasion by Vladimir. In fact,
carry on.
more than 18 months after the outbreak of the war of invasion by Vladimir Putin against Ukraine and its people, Comrade Roger takes up the element of language distilled by the propaganda services of Russian state. In this condition, how can we have a debate that does not turn into a boxing match in a quarter of an hour? Roger has a crucial responsibility in the positioning of Win through his status as a veteran and a leader within the revolutionary movement since the 60s, and as one of the main initiators and animators of Win. In addition, Roger is an undeniable reputation and audience within the Labour left in UK and internationally. This is why we are sorry to see its current positioning. Certainly, he accompanies with general internationalist remarks the negative argument towards the nation and the Ukrainian people towards
Where's the sound gone?
Sorry. That's why we are sorry to. Certainly, he accompanies with general internationalist remarks the negative argument towards the nation and the Ukrainian people towards its fight for independence and its freedom. But in this case, the display of principle of internationalist fraternity between workers flats flat if there is no prior recognition of the different status of the two states. On the one hand, the current Russian state, the assumed continuation of the Russian Empire in the lineage of the Tsars and Stalin, that is to say, the imperialist state, colonizer, oppressor, aggressor of the Ukrainian people. This Russian state is also the oppressor and colonizer within the border of the Russian Federation of many small peoples colonized since the dawn of Tsarist time, for instance, Chechen, Bashkir, Buryat, Kalmuk, Sakha, Abkhaz, Osset, and many other people. These small peoples have the fiction of autonomous political institution in the framework of the Russian Federation, but suffer the bloody burden of the mass conscription when Putin organized roundups of the entire male population to wage his war. On the other side, a nation who has fought for centuries for its independence from Muscovy, and which between 1917 and 1921 experienced its own revolution alongside the Russian Revolution. A people who have known the murderous effect of Stalinism, with in particular the mass genocide of 1932-33, entered in the history under the name of Holodomor. It should be noted in passing that one of the destructive effects of comparable importance to the Holodomor is the extermination of the entire militant generation that had made the revolution of 1921. These two facts, the mass genocide and the physical liquidation of the labor movement, in particular the Communist Party of Western Ukraine, of which Roman Rodolsky was a member, during the purge of the year 34-38, which destroyed the Bolshevik Party of Lenin and Trotsky. These two facts created the conditions for the emergence of Banderism, an ethnic nationalism of fascist inspiration. Banderism is an offshoot of Stalinism. Between colonizer and colonized, there is no equality. This is the basic that Lenin revealed on the rights of oppressed nationalities in the controversies provoked by the World War between 1914 and 1917. Lenin taught that the workers of the imperialist and colonizing state had a duty of solidarity towards the peoples colonized by their state and their bourgeoisie. Between 1921 and 1923, in debates within the Bolshevik Party, Lenin took a clear stand for the rights to independence and sovereignty of Ukraine. The Ukrainian question then weighted in the direction of the creation of the USSR, that is to say, a free union of sovereign Soviet Republic. Unfortunately, the demise of the of the workers' democracy with the degeneration of the Soviets did not give a real free union and of real sovereign Soviet republics. Stalin at that time supported the creation of an equivalent of the current Russian Federation, where the colonized peoples of the Tsarist Empire would have remained in the same situation as before 1917. And we have since known how much Putin execrates Lenin as creator of Ukraine. The bureaucratization of the first worker states, who have survived longer than the Paris Commune of 1871 and the Helsinki Commune of 1918, led to an internal counter-revolution which led to the resurgence of national oppression comparable or even worse than that of Tsarist epoch, with mass deportation against entire peoples like Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, Chechen, Balts, Poles, Ukrainians, with extermination policies like the Holodomor and the resumption of anti-Semitism, which did not disappear with the death of Stalin in 1953. At the end of the 30s, in several important texts, Trotsky took up this Bolshevik heritage by reaffirming the right of self-determination and independence for the Ukrainian nation. And he links that issue with the question of overthrow of Stalinism with what he labeled as political revolution. So, all that should, in 2023, all that should be thrown away. Should the rights of peoples, that is to say democracy applied to national groups, give way to super interest? But what higher interest? All the talk of dismissing the Ukrainian camps and the Russian invader back to back, or worse, describing a war waged by NATO and the EU against Russia, has a terrible consequences. It enacts an absolute ban on to revolt, to rise up, to mobilize, to defend themselves for the workers and the peoples having the misfortune to find themselves in one of the so-called anti-imperialist countries, or more broadly, those of the BRICS. This orientation has directly counter-revolutionary consequences in the conditions of today's world, that is the multipolar world. The former hegemonic imperialism of the years 1940-45 until the 2000, the USA, is in decline, even if it remains number one. It is in increasing competition with former accomplices like the countries of European Union, as well as emerging powers that have acquired considerable economic and demographic weight on a global scale, mainly China and India, and a myriad of states, some of which are associated within the BRICS. It is to be noted that BRICS at the present time do not form an absolutely united bloc, and many alliances can be constantly recomposed until the outbreak of open inter-imperialist conflicts. Before 1914, diplomatic and military alliances were changing and fluctuating until the outbreak of the war. Immediately, this orientation prohibits the workers and the peoples of all the rival states of the USA from seeking to overthrow the bourgeoisie, and we can say even in Western Europe. We draw the attention of the comrades on the implication of the immediate position on Ukraine. A step-by-step response to Roger's text on Ukraine will require a book of at least 500 pages to deliver all the historical development from the establishment of Kiev and Moscow in the Middle Ages to the end of the USSR, the reminder of the nature of the Ukrainian national movement from the end of the 19th century until the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917-1921, the place and leading role of the Ukrainian socialist and Marxist parties in this history, a story that both Putin and those nostalgic of Bandera do not want to see reappear. The fact since 1991 and the Ukraine accession to independence, and the reality of the political development since the Orange Revolution of 2004 and the Maidan in 2014. What we regret is the lack of interest in the uprising of the Ukrainian people from February 24, when the self-organized mobilization of broad layers of society enabled the failure of the initial offensive of Putin. This uprising can be compared to what happened in Spain in 1936, when the masses confronted the Franco-Puchists with their bare hands because of the practical and political disarmament resulting from the policy of the Popular Front government, or during the insurgencies of liberation in France, Italy, Yugoslavia, or Greece in 1944-45. On February 25, Joe Biden offered Zelensky a taxi to flee for exile. The Ukrainians responded through the acts of resistance that they did not want to become the serf of the new Tsar again, possibly assisted by local oligarchs with a national conscience indexed on the state of their bank accounts. As an oppressed and colonized nation, threatened with genocide, Ukraine has an unconditional right to defense and therefore to harm against the historic imperial power currently embodied by the regime of Vladimir Putin. Today, there is a choice to make: to support Ukrainian workers against the imperialist and genocidal aggressor and against the antisocial effects of the current neoliberal government of Ukraine. The condition for the full and complete development of the labor movement, as well as that development of other social movements, feminists, ecologists, LGBT, students, etc., requires a guarantee of the national freedom of these people. No democratic freedoms, no social progress without national liberation. In Apelutsoc, our grouping and our bulletin, through our activities within the European Network of Solidarity with Ukraine, throughout our support for Union Solidarity convoys, we have the honor of meeting and exchanging with activists of the Ukrainian left from the social movement, the Ukrainian word is socialist work, to anarchists, feminists, student activists, industrial trade unionists. We invite the comrades present today to engage in these solidarity activities. The practical minimum of these shows focus on the basic demand for the immediate withdrawal of Putin's army from the entire territory of Ukraine. This is where it all has to start. Thanks for your attention, comrade.
Thanks very much for that, Olivier. Right, so I've got a list of people that want to speak here. As I say, I'll let Olivier speak for longer because I do understand he has a position he wants to put forward, and in the traditional way, we welcome people's opinions, different opinions for us. I've let him go. If everybody else could sit for about 10 minutes, then we could always have another round later on. So can I first ask which of the Swedish comrades wants to come in now?
The outbreak of the war, the 24th of February 2022, have unleashed a series of not only military but also economically and politically events. One is that for a limited period of time, it has given momentum to the US imperialism. It has been able to unite the European Union behind it. It could get its European members to start delivering weapons to the Ukraine and to start rearmament of countries like Germany, Britain, France, Japan, Sweden, Finland, and everybody else. And all the political parties, the media, and nearly everyone else have been rallying behind US imperialism. This is a tragic event. I'm talking politically now. I haven't gone into what's happening in the Ukraine. In Sweden, the pressure have been tremendous. It has been like this. You must forget all the crimes of US imperialism. Forget the Vietnam War. Forget the Dominican Republic in 1965. Forget about Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, where US was involved. Forget about Mossadegh in Iran, Afghanistan 2001. Forget about Iraq 2003. And forget about the concentration camps of US citizens with Japanese origins. Forget about the atom bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Burn all the books of history and blank your memory. The history have restarted. Remember one thing and one thing only. What happened the 24th of February 2022? The full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And that is the pressure that has been put on society and all its political trends. And in Sweden, we have seen a lot of people who have capitulated before this pressure. Not everyone could take this pressure. And in Sweden, a long-standing opposition against joining NATO have been swept aside in the most undemocratic way. And Sweden have decided to join NATO together with Finland. And it's a big step back for the workers' movement in Sweden, for the youth and everybody else. Of course, there are some Stalinist remnants that always reacts like this. The enemies of our enemies is our friends, and US imperialism is our enemy, and therefore Putin, Kremlin, is our friend. And this is, of course, wrong. Putin is the godfather of the capitalists, oligarchs in Russia, and he must be disposed of, one way or another. But this is the pressure we are under, and not everybody can take it. And I just want to say this, and then it's the only thing. When I read the contribution from Oliver and Vincent, I thought, these are two comrades that have not been able to stand up to this pressure. Now, some comments about the document written by Roger, because in my eyes there are only one document to comment on. And I think it's a basically very good document. Roger shows that there are three components in this war. And I will make some brief comments about that. First of all, we must oppose the Russian invasion, decided by an elite in Russia that suppresses its own working class and people, and that would suppress the Ukrainian people and working class too. And I think the document made by Roger very clearly opposes the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also have demands to back that up. Secondly, we have to realize, and I think Roger is very correct, there is a proxy war going on, and we must oppose the expansion of NATO, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also the expansion of NATO eastwards. This is part of the same process. Just like the rearmament of the countries like Germany, Britain, France, Japan, Sweden, etc. This is a way to move more US military force to the Indo-Pacific, a move that will threaten a war with China. This is part of the same process, the same movement globally. Geopolitical is the word I'm looking for. And this calls for a sort of third position. This is an expression used in Sweden from 1940s and onwards. And today, a sort of third position would mean not only to oppose the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, but also remembering all the crimes made by US imperialism, which we are supposed to forget, and restart our memories the 24th of February. We have to oppose the invasion, but we also have to impose the maneuvers of US imperialism that in many ways are trying to compensate for its economical demise by its military force. And a third position is that we stand up to both those powers. And I think the document is trying to do this. The third thing in the document is the differences between the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine and the majority. And to propose, even if it's in practice today, it seems very far-fetched. How can you organize a referendum? But still, those tensions exist. They are real. So to complicate things, it's a very correct position to do that. There are also a third component in the war. And I think to the list of demands, to the demand referendums is absolutely correct. We have to realize that there is such a component in this war. So there are definitely three components, and that's the strong part of this document. It doesn't back away from anything. What could be added, I believe, is that the Maidan section of the document should be renamed Maidan and the Civil War. And that part should be expanded. It needs to be expanded because once we use the expression civil war, we have to back it up with more facts and figures. Still, a civil war could be on different levels because of the involvement of the big powers. And a civil war could look different. The one in Spain during the 30s I will finish what they also. All right, but nevertheless, I think we should add one demand to the list, and I think from what we said about the threat of a bigger war, I think we should call for a sort of immediate restart of peace negotiations, and that demand, a restart of peace negotiations could put pressure on both parts, and peace talks can't be dismissed as unrealistic because they can start although the war is still raging on. It will be an attempt to put pressure on both parts to reveal their demands of today, not on the 23rd of February 2022. And finally, it could mobilize people around the very word of peace, because peace is nothing to be, contemptuous about. Peace is a powerful word in the world today, and it could be even more powerful. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Jan. Bob Archer, do you want to go next? Don't forget to unmute yourself. You're muted.
Yeah, I'll be as brief as I can. And first of all, I'd like to comment that it's been a real privilege to be in this discussion with the spread of comrades that we've got, and that we're at the very beginning of a discussion amongst ourselves and others. And the experience we have in Britain with discussions of principle, we had one around the leaving the European Union, which led to breaches. Comrades never talked to each other, and families never talked to each other for months and months on end. And I wouldn't like to see that happen here. However, I'm astonished that Roger has repeated all the things that the supporters of the Russian have been saying to me in my trade union work and in the Trades Council in Redbridge, where I'm the secretary. They've all been assuming that because NATO is a gang of crooks, thieves, blackmailers and murderers, which they are, therefore we must support the Russians. And it's sort of the same material that has been brought in here under the heading of peace. Now, I just want to say something about a call for peace. It can be platonic, for one thing. Children, you should stop fighting. But as soon as you say the main question is peace, then you have to have a conception of the settlement that you're going for. Which is it? You're going to let some of the country be taken away? Let's remember who you're dealing with. The Russian